What you got, Bree?
A BIC is the supervisory broker, correct?
Yes, the broker in charge, which is what we call them, and they're basically the managing broker, the supervisory broker in our state. And then, of course, in other states that don't have BICs, some have we just call them employing brokers or supervisory brokers. But yeah.
Yeah, so in the book, it says that on the agreement, they can be amended to change the supervisory broker. Why would somebody be able to change their BIC?
I mean, I don't know the context of what you're reading in the book, but you can change firms, you can change offices, you can do all that, and that's going to change your BIC every single time.
And you can still take your client with you.
No, you can change your BIC, but that doesn't mean that it's your. Remember that's the firm's clients. So if you work for ABC Realty under me as your BIC, and you say screw Seth, I hate him, and you leave and you go join Brad's firm, PPQ Realty under him, and he's your new BIC. You're leaving that client with me because that was my firm's client. But you can pick a new BIC and leave the firm.
Okay.
Yeah. You're probably not going to make any money off that transaction.
Yeah, I was just kind of confused when you started explaining that, but I'll text it and see if you can explain it after you get a chance to look at it. And maybe
Yeah, if you take a picture of the context, that's fine.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask y'all an advanced question, okay? Let's go back to, and I like that I just can keep going back to these things that I put on the screen here. Let's go back to this scenario with Bridge and Paige both working for XYZ Realty. Can Bridge and Paige share confidential information about their clients with each other? Just as a generic question, don't think about anything we're talking about right now. Can they share confidential information about their clients with each other? So here's the advanced topic. Here's the reason why I'm bringing this into play here. Folks, remember how agency works. XYZ is the agent, which means everybody represents everybody. So technically, Bridge is equally as responsible for looking after Paige's seller as Paige is responsible for looking after Bridge's buyer, because we default to the worthless crap. So could they share confidential information? Yes. But why would they probably not want to?
Because they're looking out for their client's best interest.
There you go, Brad. Because if they do share that confidential information, it could prevent them from becoming designated if that was to arise. So can the firm share secrets with everybody in the firm? Yeah. Folks, even if we were just doing a dual agency transaction, if this transaction was happening, not designated, but just dual, and the transaction's happening, is it still okay for Bridge and Paige to talk about the secrets of the seller and the secrets of the buyer with each other? Doing dual, doing this transaction with Bridge and Paige, would it be okay for them to share secrets with each other on the seller and the buyer? Yeah. Because nobody can use them. They can tell them to each other, but neither of them can tell them to the buyer or the seller. Bound and gagged and worthless. What harm could come if they're doing it legally correctly? What harm could come from them sharing the secrets? None. Because they're not allowed to use them in dual. So be very careful with the context of test questions. Of course, can they share secrets in the firm? Yes. Might they not want to? Yes, probably not, because that could, cause issues with dual age or designated arising, because if they already have that confidential information. But you've got to understand these things quite literally. Don't ever put extra things in the question that's not there. So you always default to the worthless crap. And then, of course, you would have to look for other telltale signs of like words like designated, advocated, was, all these different pieces. Now, here's where I'm going to circle back around, and I'm going to bring some of the stuff we learned on day 1 and day 2 into the equation here. Can a sole practitioner, okay, remember the word sole proprietorship and sole practitioner. If you see the word sole practitioner, that means just one person. If you see the word sole proprietorship, it's a business being ran through a person, but it could be multiple people. So if I was a sole practitioner, me, myself, and I operating with my broker's license legally, can I do dual agency? Yeah. Of course I could. I could represent the buyer and the seller in the same transaction and be completely and utterly worthless through it, but I can do it. Could I, as a sole practitioner, me, myself, and I, operating a brokerage business through my license legally, could I do designated dual agency? No, because there is no other person to designate. Okay? If I was a sole proprietorship and I had 6 affiliated licensees that were all full brokers, could I then do designated dual agency? Yeah. Okay. If I had a brokerage firm, but I was the only licensee within that firm, can my firm do dual agency? Just dual. Yes. If I was a firm with 2 licensees, but the other licensee was a provisional broker, can I do designated dual agency? You see what I just did there? I increased it to 2 people, but I'd have to be the BIC, and the only other person I have is a provisional broker. Can I do designated? No, because that would break that rule. Let me change it. Firm has 2 licensees, the BIC and a full broker. Can we now do designated dual agency? Yes. Do you see how such minute details in the question changes the entirety of the question? It's not about firm or sole proprietorship. It's about how many members. What are their license statuses? What is the question? Who are we asking if you're representing them? There is so many nuances to this crap, and you've got to pay attention. It's really cruel and unusual, I know. But I promise I'm trying to train your brains to catch the things that they're going to throw at you on the test. Now, just one more piece of clarity here in the designated dual agency discussion, folks. I keep saying one has been designated to represent the buyer, one has been designated to represent the seller. It could be more, right? We could say you 2 are going to blood for the seller, you 2 are going for the buyer. It could be a brokerage team, right? This team is representing the seller, this team is representing the buyer. Don't get so technical there. It's just they have been designated, they are on teams, they are going for blood, but it is still a type of duel. Told you, don't ever call this exclusive. It acts exclusive, but it's not. Bree, did you just send me that thing? Is that what I just saw on my phone? Oh, okay. So the context of it, a listing agreement or buyer's agency agreement may be amended to establish a designated agency relationship, to change a designated agent, or to change supervisory brokers at any time pursuant to a written addendum. It's just basically saying, contractually speaking, everything can be changed. And so Imagine that we started off where the buyer nor seller authorized dual agency. Well, they can amend it and authorize dual agency. Imagine they authorize dual but not designated. They could amend it and authorize designated. And imagine that we wanted the transaction to happen as designated. We could temporarily affiliate, going back to that screen I showed you with another broker in charge at a different office so that we could do designated. It's still the same firm at that point. So it's not the client's not leaving with you, you're not leaving the firm, but we could designate you to a different BIC of a different office, same firm, and then that way you could legally do the designated dual agency transaction against them because that's no longer your BIC. That's what that's saying. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So we are rocking and rolling with agency. And as much as you don't like it, hopefully, to me, it seems like y'all are grasping it pretty well. And this does not go away. This is single-handedly one of the most testable aspects on both my exam and the state licensing exam, on both the national and the state. Now, of course, the national questions are going to be a little more generic. Designated dual agency, all that stuff exists on both sides. But, you know, some of the rules that, like, the provisional broker can't do designated against a broker in charge, that's a state-specific thing because, remember, we said some states don't even have a BIC. Now, the other thing that I'll point out to you, when we were having some introductory conversations to agency last week, I introduced a term called a facilitator or a transactional broker. So let me bring that back. Remember, I told you that's not a thing in North Carolina. We do not do transactional brokerage or facilitating brokerage. In North Carolina, we have to have somebody to represent. And so in transactional or facilitating brokerage, you don't represent anybody. You're, you know, just a paper push in that regard. Now I want you to understand the difference here. Transactional brokerage, you have loyalties to nobody, which means you're a paper pusher. In dual agency, you have loyalties to everybody, which means you're a paper pusher. So inherently, they work the same, but you have to understand the testable difference. One is loyalties to no one. One is loyalties to both. But at the end of the day, they're basically both just, what do you want to do? Technicality, right? Now, one little interesting tidbit here. I don't know exactly how testable they're going to get on this in North Carolina, but when we're dealing with listing a home, folks, one of the biggest perks of the job as a real estate broker is you can list your own home. You can be your own buyer's agent. But if you're listing your own home, obviously you have this ownership interest. You would never be allowed to do dual agency on your own personal home. There is a huge conflict of interest there. Even if you say you're going to be dual and you're going to be unbiased, yeah, right. You're going to be unbiased on your own personal transaction. So dual agency is prohibited if it is your personal transaction. Now, of course, when it comes to representation, there is one minor exemption that says we could represent a buyer in the purchase of a commercial property specifically if we had less than a 25%, less than, right, meaning 24% or less interest in this commercial property, and we fully disclose that interest to a buyer, that would be allowable. And that's the piece that I really don't know if it's going to be testable or not. It is very much a North Carolina thing, but so oddly specific. If that makes it on the test, I'd be surprised. But the not being able to do dual agency when it's your personal listing, that's something you definitely need to know, because that'd be a huge conflict of interest. So let me ask you a question, as I tend to do. Better yet, you read it, you answer it, and then I'll read it to you, and I'll answer it. Most of y'all have a consensus in the chat. There's a couple outliers there. Billy is a provisional broker with Go Realty and works out of the Durham office. His client is very interested in buying a home listed by Brandon White, broker in charge of the Go Realty Raleigh office. Can Billy and Brandon work as designated agents on this sale? Folks, key pieces to take away from this question. You've got the Durham office, you've got the Raleigh office, which means that is not his broker in charge. So can they do designated dual agency against each other? Yes, they can. It is not his broker in charge. Okay, specifically cannot do it against your own. So earlier, I introduced first substantial contact, and I also talked to you about PTM, price, terms, motivation. Well, here's where we get to finally talk about the agency disclosure, because some of you are so eager to get it, and we're going to, right? You have to understand there is a method to the madness. I teach things in a very certain order for a very specific reason, and sometimes you just got to wait, and it will come to fruition. And so I've already told you, when we're dealing with old car, we would never disclose our client's confidential information because that'd be a breach of our fiduciary duties and a violation of the confidentiality piece of old car. However, I also told you that we would always have to disclose customer confidential information to our clients. Very important thing to understand. And so when we're dealing with what would be deemed confidential information, here's the way to think about it. If it could be used against somebody in a transaction, it's probably confidential. Now, of course, PTM is just a way to help you remember it. Price, terms, motivation. That they'd pay more than what they offered, that the seller would accept less than what they listed it for. How fast of a closing do they need? How long of a closing do they need? Are they, why are they moving? Do they have to do this for a job crunch, a job transfer, nasty divorce? All of these things could be potentially used against somebody in a negotiation. And so once we start getting into those territories of conversations, that's deemed confidential. And so really and truthfully, when we're dealing with the honesty and fairness we owe customers, I told you what it really comes down to is we have to look customers in the face and tell them, if I don't work for you, I will screw you over. Do not tell me your secrets. That's the honesty and fairness we owe them. And of course, following laws and material facts disclosures. And so because, folks, we had such an issue back in the day when I gave you that story time of nobody really knew who they worked for. Buyers saw they had representation. Agents didn't realize that they weren't working for buyers, even though everybody always worked for the sellers. And so part of the thing that came from some of those changes was a disclosure on agency. And we call it the Working with Real Estate Agents Disclosure in North Carolina. It's just, let's explain how agency works. Let's explain what you need to know. Let's explain when you should keep your mouth shut. Folks, did any of you in here have the slightest inkling that it worked like this before you sat in this classroom? No. You can shake your head and say yes. The answer is still no. Okay, let's just be completely honest about it. It's still no. Because there's just so much to it. People misunderstand things. And so what we owe to consumers is to inform them of how this works. Now, the thing is, this disclosure, I told you, key pieces. The Working with Real Estate Agents disclosure is not required in all transactions. That would be a false statement, right? It is required in sales transactions only, both residential and commercial. Key piece number one, if you pick all transactions on the test, you will get that question wrong. Students do it all the time. So the Working with Real Estate Agents disclosure is required in sales transactions only. The other critically important piece is you have to understand that except for the one trigger that was initial contact, if you never get into confidential territory, you never had to disclose how agency worked. It is only if first substantial contact is triggered. And we said first substantial contact is when the conversation starts going to confidential territory. Okay, price, terms, motivation, things that could be used against them in a negotiation. Now, this last piece says brokers keep the acknowledgement of the disclosure in the file for 3 years. That is what we call the retention of records rule. In North Carolina, you have to keep all records for 3 years from the date of last activity. And we'll talk about that multiple times in multiple different ways. But all records have to be retained for 3 years from the date of last activity. Beverly, what is your very specific question on when agency should occur?
So essentially, say you as the seller obtain a listing agent, you're going through the process of listing the home. So now they are privy to lots of information, inspections, so on and so forth. If an offer comes in for the home and it is originated out of the same office, is the listing agent, should they say, hey, there's an issue of dual agency, we have a buyer, but it's within my firm, because how else, you know what I mean, the client would not know that, I'm not sure how the client would know how the buyer was procured. Does that make sense? Or where they originated from?
It does make sense. Let me help you out with a couple pieces. Number one, understand that right now we are talking about agency disclosure, and this should be thought of as step one. And remember what I told you, this agency disclosure that we're about to look at never, ever, 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 ever creates an agency relationship. So in your scenario, they would have gone over this with you before you signed a listing agreement. But once they sign a listing agreement, you have an agency contract with them that hired them as your agent. And remember what I said a few moments ago, you're talking about an offer coming in from the same firm. Well, that's dual agency. And you can't do dual agency without informed and written consent. That consent happens on the listing agreement. So you probably already gave consent on the listing agreement, whether you realized it or not, when they were reviewing the listing agreement with you. Now, if you did not give consent, it should not have happened, because that would be unlawful. You cannot do dual agency without informed and written consent. But let's just be completely honest, Beverly. There's so much involved in a transaction that we look at the sellers and we explain the listing agreement and we tell them this is what they're agreeing to, and we ask if they have any questions, and then they say no, and then they just sign it. Sure. So, yeah, most people will come back after, the fact and say, well, my agent never told me this, and I never, and I'm like, well, you probably didn't want to know it. I mean, let's just be completely honest, right? And so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, first, substantial contact. Okay, the second the conversation starts going into confidential territory, price, terms, motivation, things of that nature. Let me give you a scenario, folks. If I'm holding an open house at 702 Walnut Street, okay, I told you every once in a while I throw Walnut Street into the mix, okay, to keep you on your toes, because I know Main Street gets a little boring. So I'm holding a listing at 702 Walnut Street, or holding an open house at 702 Walnut Street. And I want you to imagine that every single one of you comes through the open house. Now, if you're not familiar with an open house, it's pretty house, doors open, come on in, there's an agent, look at the house. That's what an open house is in a nutshell. And imagine that every single one of you come in one after the other, and every single conversation goes like this. Oh, this is such a pretty house. And I say, yeah, it sure is. And I said, what's it listed at? And I said, well, $425. And I said, well, how many bedrooms? And I said, well, it's 4. And they said, well, how many bathrooms? I said, it's 3. And they say, well, this is really nice granite. I like this. I said, me too. And then they say, you mind if we look around? I said, you help yourself. Let me know if you have any questions. If every single one of you come through that open house, and that's exactly how the conversation goes, folks, did we ever have any confidential conversations? No. Not once did I need to give any of you the working with real estate agents disclosure. None of you. Zero, zip, nada. The trigger is first substantial contact. So now imagine that somebody comes in after all of you come in, and the questions go the exact same, but then at the very end they say, well, great, listen, I really love this house and I have $600,000 in cash in the bank. Have we hit confidential territory now? Yes. And so that's the trigger, folks. The second this, because we're not mind readers, we don't know if it's ever going to happen. But the second it happens, here's what you got to do, right? You got to get super awkward. You go, shh, boop, and you boop them on the nose, and you say, shh, don't tell me your secrets. Let me explain how agency works in North Carolina, and then you give them the working with real estate agents disclosure. By the way, don't do that. People probably would not take very kindly to you, like all over there, especially during COVID time. When I made that joke, I said definitely don't do that. That's really going to weird some people out. Of course, have you ever seen, any of y'all ever seen the movie Team America? You remember that movie back in the day? I was talking to somebody about that, and they're like, I've never seen it. And it was like the puppets from the creators of South Park. There's one hilarious scene where he's like shushing the person, and he puts the finger like over her eye because their puppet's like shh. You just have, who have been there if you haven't seen it. Okay, it's fine. Y'all judge me. So you stop them, and you have to give them, it is always, Genesis, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, that's the best. You have to stop the conversation, and you have to give them, now it's always going to be tested as a written disclosure. I'm going to show you the form. It's a form. It is a written, does it have to be paper? No. You could email it to them. You could hand them a paper copy, but it is always going to be tested as a written disclosure. There's an actual form, and then it's not just give it to them. We have to review it with them to make sure they understand the key pieces of it. So the deadline is first substantial contact in all sales transactions, and it is a written disclosure. These are all very key words from a testable point of view. And so I'm going to make sure you understand something, folks. Your test is never going to be based off of best practices. So if I say that's the deadline, do you think it'd be legally adequate for me to just automatically give one to people when they walk in an open house? You think I could do that? Sure. It'd be overkill, right? I don't have to do it. But it would not be unlawful for me to give it to them prematurely. But your test is never going to be about best practices. It's not going to be what's about, a good practice. It's not going to be about anything like that. It's going to say, what's the deadline? When's the last time? What is the criteria? Beverly says, I've never seen people do it. Me neither. And I will tell you, this is one of those things that what I'm teaching you is how you should be tested. But 90% of brokers suck at doing this the legally correct way. I'm just going to be completely honest with you, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. I said, don't worry about what you've seen in the real world, focus on what I'm teaching you because it's, the trigger. So when the conversation starts to go to confidential territory, you stop the conversation and you explain the agency disclosure. And basically you're going to see it in a second. You're going to say, well, there's buyer's agents who represent buyers and look after their best interests. There's seller's agents who represent sellers and look after their best interests. There's dual agency, which is where the firm represents the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. There's designated dual agency, which is where we designate one to go for blood for the buyer, one licensee to go for blood for the buyer, and one to go for blood for the seller, and they can actually advocate on their client. And hey, understand, you could also be unrepresented. It's a little more in-depth than that, but that's basically in a nutshell. And so we wrap up this agency disclosure, and you're going to see this verbatim. They've got to understand, if you're not hiring me, do not tell me your secrets. Think of it like the Miranda rights for real estate, folks. What are the Miranda rights?
Anything you say will be held against you.
There you go. Don't threaten me with a good time. I shouldn't have done that. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, right? Yeah. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can. Cheyenne, I appreciate you laughing at my nonsense because somebody's got to, all right? And listen, Cheyenne's the only one helping me out. I just say things to keep you on your toes. The Miranda rights is what they slap you with when they're arresting you, right? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Folks, this is the exact same thing in real estate land. You have the right to remain silent, consumer. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a real estate transaction. In other words, if you don't hire me and you remain a customer and you run your mouth, I will rip you a new one. And that's where I told you the honesty and fairness piece is telling them we will screw them over if they're not our client. So they know to keep their mouth shut. There you go, Genesis. Tell people not to trauma dump. Beverly says, so basically when touring an open house, you need to shut up. Well, not legally, because if you start talking confidential information, they should tell you to shut up, legally speaking, and then give you the working with real estate agents disclosure to help prevent you from putting your foot in your mouth or screwing yourself over. Now, as I said, doesn't mean they're going to do it the legally correct way, but that's what should happen. So, on that note, folks, let me give you an example here. Tell me, which of these do you think would best describe first substantial conduct if you had to pick one? Yeah, see it is. Folks, here's the thing you have to understand. There has to be some critical words there that indicate something confidential. So if you look at A, buyer states they really like screen-in porches. Folks, I really like Maseratis. I can't afford one. Okay, Lamborghinis and those neither. All right, I like lots of stuff I can't afford. Struggle is real. B says, seller states they are considering listing their home within the next 2 months. I consider buying a Lamborghini even though I can't afford it. You see the trend here, right? I consider lots of things. Doesn't mean I can do them. C, seller states they must. That is a very indicative word. Must relocate within 30 days. That suggests a time crunch, which could be used against them in negotiations. Because if there's a time crunch, you could potentially leverage that to take advantage of their situation. And then D says, buyer states that they prefer a 4-bedroom house. Yet again, preference doesn't dictate necessity. So, I mean, I prefer this many bedrooms. I prefer granite. I prefer a lot of things. It doesn't dictate necessity. So it has to be consequential. Has to be something that could be used against them in a negotiation. And if they could, then we're hitting that for a substantial contact. Now, before I actually show you the working with real estate agents disclosure, let me just kind of give you a grand scope now that you can kind of understand it a little bit more of the brokerage business, folks. Every single firm, right, that is a licensed business entity in North Carolina has to have, well, let me rephrase this, typically has to have a licensed broker in charge who is running the show. Because remember what we said early in this class, you need a broker in charge to be able to advertise, to be able to have trust accounts, and to be able to affiliate other licensees. And most brokerage firms are doing at least one of those things, and so they would typically need a BIC. The exception of that is what we call an entity created for compensation purposes only. I'll get more into that later. So then you've got your affiliated licensees, either full brokers or provisional brokers. Of course, the BIC is responsible for active and direct supervision of these provisional brokers. Full brokers they're still responsible for in certain capacities, things like advertisements, things like agency and disclosures, active statuses, all these different things. And so all of the individual licensees are considered sub-agents, just so you can kind of get a grand understanding of how this all flows. And remember too, you're not really an employee, even though we call it like, an employment agreement when you have an agency contract, and we'll sometimes even call your independent contractors agreement an employment agreement, but you are really self-employed typically when you're working as a real estate broker. It's more of a partnership than an employment, and we kind of work together, symbiotic, and share commissions. So hopefully this is all starting to kind of tie into some of the earlier concepts, and we're going to keep building on it because what we still haven't gotten into is the actual agency contracts themselves, which is their own section. But let me ask you a question, and then I'm going to show you the working with real estate agents disclosure. Better yet, you read it, in length, and then you tell me, and then we'll go over it. Seeing lots of no's in the chat. So it says, Sarah and John are visiting an open house in Hillsboro. The agent shows them every room in the house, talks at length about how good the schools are, and that a Harris Teeter is opening less than 2 miles away in 6 months. At no time does the agent discuss agency or the working of the real estate agent's disclosure. Was this a violation of agency? And the answer is no, because nothing confidential has happened. There is no price, terms, motivation, none of that stuff being discussed. No confidential territory, no need to give the disclosure.